The content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for any health concerns. Take care of yourself out there. Welcome to Unravelling, a podcast that looks at the world through the lens of mental health. I'm Kurt White, a psychotherapist and social worker.
And I'm Mary Wilson, a journalist. And Kurt, last episode, we spoke with Dr. Sekula, all about his approach to reimagining mental health systems.
Yes, a number of things stuck with me about that, and in particular this idea of creativity and autonomy and really listening to people without trying to change them at all, listening to the expertise and valuing in a really deep way the way that people can find creative solutions to their own challenging problems, sometimes much better than anyone else.
And we wanted to know if others were doing this kind of work, were doing things differently. And we found Project Let's, which is an organization out of Providence, Rhode Island, which is all about centering people's voices with lived experience through the peer support model.
Yeah, what does that mean, the voices of people with lived experience?
Involving people who are really experiencing some of these mental health challenges and who may not see them as issues or things to be fixed, but rather an integral part of their human experience.
It's really interesting. A very different perspective than I think a lot of people are used to hearing about, isn't it?
Absolutely different. And that raises some really big questions.
It really does, doesn't it? I think who gets to decide what a mental health problem is and how do we define it? What are the implications of it once we've defined it about how a person is going to do or what they're going to be able to sort of do or what help they'll need or what medicines they'll need or where they'll be able to live, There's all kinds of embedded assumptions that we have about all of these things that are very often being decided not really by the people most affected by these problems.
And getting some answers to those big questions, we are going to hear from someone with lived experience, Stefanie Lyn Kaufman-Mthimkhulu.
That's really interesting. Tell me about Stefanie.
Yeah, Stefanie is the founder and director of the nonprofit Project Let's. Project Let's is a national grassroots organization and movement focused on creating innovative, peer-led alternatives to our current mental health system. And their work includes peer support and communicative care, political advocacy, organizing, and mutual aid.
I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to teach us about these important questions.
Hi, it's Mary cutting in to let you know that we'd like to hear from you. We've had so many interesting discussions on this podcast and so many guests who we've spoken to. And now it's your turn to add your voice to the mix. We'd love to hear any questions or feedback, comments about the topics we've covered.
Or new topics, things that you see in your own lives about where does a mental health lens intersect with the world from your point of view? Are there things you'd like for us to tackle or talk about? Either in a big way or in a little bite-sized way on an upcoming episode. We hope that you'll give us a call, email us, send us a voice memo. We've got a phone number. That's 802-258-3763, 802-258-3763, or 258-3POD, or an email address, unravel@brattlebororetreat.org. We'll have those also in the show notes. Send us a voice memo, leave us a voice message, or just send us an old-fashioned email. We'd love to hear from you.
And now back to the episode. Stefanie, welcome. Thank you so much for being with me here on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's jump right in and begin with the birth of Project Let's. You started this organization back in high school, right?
Yeah, I started doing this work when I was about 14 years old. I lost a friend to suicide in high school, and the response to that by our school district was handled really poorly. There were just hundreds of students who were affected, who were deeply grieving, who lacked any supports, anywhere to go. And there was also this element of, even if we knew that there was a social worker or a guidance counselor who was connected to the school, whose job it was to help us, we were also very aware that that could make its way back to our parents, or that our autonomy or our consent or our confidentiality could be violated, particularly sharing things within the context of school. So it was something where at first Project Let's was really rooted in this idea that we were really lacking in awareness about what we call mental illness and what to do collectively as a society. But I think our strategies at the time were really rooted in, okay, how do we talk to the teachers, to the adults, and advocate for them to have more training so that they are safer people to come to?
Wow. Was there a specific moment looking back that you just realized, I have to take action here and step in and do something?
I had been navigating my own experiences with neurodivergence. And I think at this time, having experienced my friend's suicide and this like breaking open in this grieving process, my own experiences started like unraveling and things started flaring up and becoming very severe for me. And so I began sharing my experiences and my stories in community, and essentially doing what I could to fill gaps that I saw. And an experience that really sits with me is going to the wake of my friend at 14 years old and just kind of watching this train of students go and visit her casket and then leave this funeral home and like sitting in a parking lot, hysterical crying or screaming, and there was no one there.
So you were witnessing this grief from the kids around you, and that is really what influenced your vision, right, for the peer-led mental health support system. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I think one thing that was really evident at that time of life was that I too was somebody who had a really strong preference for seeking support from my peers. And I think there's often a misconception that young people can't handle difficult conversations. They can't handle mental health conversations or mental health crises. And I remember in middle school and high school, there were big things happening like self-injury, suicidal thoughts, friends who had parents who were navigating alcoholism or violence within the home or sexual violence. And we came to each other at 3 a.m. We would be on the phone with each other. We would be doing all of that support. And so it was something that was really natural within some of my circle. And then also realizing that there's a lot of people that want to help and want to support and simply don't have those tools.
You started this work at such a young age, and when you were dealing with the death of a friend and tried to implement some of this peer support, how did you see this affect your friends and family who tried to lean on each other?
I think it showed up in different ways, as grieving often does. There was a collective sense within the circle that I was part of just being abandoned. There was very much a sense of outrage at the response. I think community members were hoping to receive somewhat of a loving response to the grieving that was happening. And it ended up being really rooted in fear and in punishment, right? So there was this mismatch there among folks who were seeking care and how it played out and was distributed among members in the community.
Why is it so important for people with lived experience to be involved with peer support?
For so many reasons. I think historically we've seen people who have lived experience have been left out of all parts of research processes, designing what programs and services look like, even determining what healing looks like, right? That's something that is very personal and is something that really can only be self-determined. But when you're interacting with the mental health system, particularly out of force, you are told that healing looks like maybe therapy or taking medication or hospitalization. There's this limit on what healing can be. We also know that even within the context of the mental health system, like thinking about therapy, what is often so healing for people is the relationship that is built between the patient and the client and the provider. And that's something that happens so naturally in peer support as well, this level of relationship building. Something else that's really important to uplift is this level of mutuality, which really means we are both coming to this relationship with things to learn and things to offer to each other. And within the mental health system, there's this power imbalance, right? Of you have the provider who is the healer, the expert, they're coming in with their knowledge, and you are coming in as the sick person or the patient and the person who needs help. And that power imbalance can often feel or become really violent for people in a variety of ways. And then also wanting to uplift what is often called like embodied knowledge, right? That, for example, if I am a wheelchair user, there is a type of knowledge that I have that is embodied, that comes from my experiences moving through the world that only other wheelchair users can have. And even that shifts from person to person, right? But again, we have this encouragement within the mental health system that your provider is the not sick person. And so it discourages that level of sharing. And I've worked with many mental health providers who are like, I have such a wealth of lived experience. I've also been a patient. But within the confines of my role and my job, I'm either discouraged from sharing that or outright told I shouldn't be connecting and sharing on those fronts.
Wow. It seems like the model has a parallel to addiction, Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, based in those peer support groups. Did you look to spaces like that? And do you see that similarity?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely elements among many different community-based groups or models that have emerged. I think one thing for us that we've thought about is we center many different ways of making sense of our experiences. So I know a lot of folks, for example, who may be AA and the kind of spiritual or the kind of very structured process that it abides by, for some people works wonderfully, for others can feel restrictive. And I think within the model of peer support that we practice, we really take a backseat in allowing a person to describe how their experiences make sense to them. So for example, if somebody I'm working with is telling me that they hear voices and they've heard voices since they're a child, and that has always been interpreted in a positive way, or it's culturally rooted in some type of experience that's shared in their cultural traditions, I'm not going to try and convince them that they are psychotic and that they have an illness, which is often the strategy that you find maybe within the mental health system, or even sometimes within community-based groups, that it's like you have to kind of abide by a particular framework. So for us, that would be a space where we really lean into that way that that person has made sense of that and kind of co-design a support process that's really rooted in what this person is looking for and what they need. And then the other piece I would say is that we are very strongly rooted in an anti-oppressive lens and framework, which means that we recognize all the different ways that because of how we are, who we are, our identities, how that affects how we're treated, what resources we can access. So sometimes when people are coming to us in crisis, they need money. They are behind on bills. They have structural barriers in place that have brought them to the point of crisis. And at Project Let's, for example, we have mutual aid funds that are available to help support people in those moments. So recognizing again that a peer supporter's work might be in getting someone a financial stipend or going grocery shopping for them. So this kind of, again, wide range of what is possible, when I think traditional peer support has often stayed in this realm of talking to each other, which is a critical component, but for us, kind of one piece of the puzzle.
Wow. You're coming up against these systems that are set up to insulate against accountability. So how do you train people within Project Let's, and what do you think about the accountability and safety of patients and peers?
Whew, yes. One thing is that we have been, particularly in the context of folks who are, again, perceived as or labeled with or diagnosed with mental health conditions, we are perceived to think of that as an individual biological failure that has nothing to do with what's happening around us. And then also, when you're interacting with different systems and it doesn't go well or you don't get your needs met, we're conditioned to believe that it's because we didn't advocate well enough or it was something that we did. And so a core part of the way that we train folks at Project Let's is not only, here are coping skills that you can share with someone. It's how did we get here? How did we end up here? And that requires us going backwards to the history of psychiatry in the US. For example, we are presented with mental health diagnoses as firm biological truths. And there is a huge investment in the pharmaceutical industry in figuring out biomarkers and genetics and all things on that front. One example that we would teach about, right, is that the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is basically the big book of diagnoses and classifications, is something that's really shape-shifted over time and been influenced by social, political, economic things that were moving at the time. So many people don't know that being queer, being gay, used to be in the DSM as a diagnosable mental illness. And we might say something in a training like, it was not that some blood test or brain scan emerged to say, aha, being queer is not a disease. That was something that was socially and politically driven and was also a decision that was made by primarily cis, straight white men sitting around at a table voting. And so when we introduce these levels of the historical reality of things like how diagnoses work, who gets diagnoses, histories of institutionalization, this allows folks to get grounded and rooted in a much bigger story that is beyond the very limited version of what we've been told. And that's not to say that our bodies and our genetics and our biology don't play a part in our mental health, but to have it all reduced to that, right? Also, the kind of other part is that if the problem lives inside of us, then we are solely and uniquely responsible for getting help, healing, addressing that. And that kind of takes the heat off of the systems and structures that are in place that can really serve to either support or uplift our well-being or really hinder our well-being.
What are just the main differences between Project Let's and traditional mental health care systems that we're all familiar with?
Ooh, so many differences. I think, one example I can give, right, is that within the context of the mental health system, it follows what's referred to as Cartesian duality, right? This idea that there's a split from the neck up and the neck down, that we have a mind and we have a body, and those are two separate things. And that has been really built into, again, the healing possibilities for what's offered to us within the mental health system. It's very focused on the mind, on how we think, on how we perceive experiences. And if we look to many indigenous traditions, have this integrated view of body, mind, and spirit. And that is so important to think about a holistic view of wellness, of healing. And many people balance different theories and different ways of making sense of our experiences. So even if we have this understanding of, I'm experiencing panic attacks because I experienced sexual violence, right? And maybe the mental health system is diagnosing that as post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe I don't resonate with that language. For me, I resonate with viewing that as a justified response, that my body is reacting in a very appropriate way actually to what I experience. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me, right? That my body is going through a certain response. But maybe I choose to seek therapy or take psychiatric medications. And maybe I balance that with seeing a non-clinical healer or using plant medicine or dancing or whatever tools I would like, right? So this kind of mix and match process, which I think is really difficult for a lot of folks within the mental health system. It's like you have to abide by this framework, this way of thinking about your experiences. And if you kind of fall outside of that, not only is there no space for that, but it can often be used as justification for other diagnoses or further harm, right? So if I don't agree with someone saying that the fact that I hear voices is an illness called psychosis, right? And my perspective is that actually those are the voices of my ancestors, that I'm communicating with my ancestors and I can hear their voices. That might be something that ends up in my medical record as justification for why I am psychotic, right? Patient is delusional. Patient believes that they're communicating with their ancestors, right? And so, we could either pathologize that and diagnose that, or we can recognize that actually many people come from cultural, spiritual, and religious traditions where that is a part of how we make sense of our experiences. So again, that capacity to follow the lead of the person that we're working with, to meet people where they're at, whether that is financial needs, housing needs, spiritual needs, other physical needs, and having the capacity to hold lots of different theories and worldviews in our toolbox at once.
Mm. And you touched on just the celebration of what some might call being crazy, but instead it's really mad pride. Tell me what mad pride is and how it's celebrated.
Yes, mad pride is something that really grew out of, in the 1970s, what is often referred to as the psychiatric survivor movement, the Mental Patients Liberation Front, or the CSX movement, which is the Consumer Ex-Patient Survivor Movement, which was essentially all of these folks who were coming out of institutions and sharing community with each other and building relationships and solidarity around what was often very harmful or violent or dehumanizing experiences that were happening inside of these institutions. And so there was an element of these movements that was centered in like rights and civil rights and accessing civil rights as people who've been labeled with mental illness. And then there was also this element of questioning, as I talked a little bit about, the categories of diagnoses. How did we end up here? Realizing that if we looked around these institutions, it's a lot of poor people. It's a lot of women. It's a lot of migrants and folks who don't speak English, and making these kinds of structural connections, right? So Mad Pride really grew out of the relationships that were sparked and built in the 70s through these collective movements. And then going even further than that, having this lens of folks who view our experiences not as an illness, but as an integral part of our identities, of how we move through the world. So you might hear in Mad Pride related spaces, folks who use the language of madness. Psych survivor spaces, people might say gifts instead of disorder. Or instead of saying psychosis, folks might say extreme states, or navigating unshared reality, right? Which is a very different way of saying like somebody is psychotic. And so there is this kind of balancing of honoring our wholeness, recognizing this as sometimes or oftentimes a really integral part of our identity, celebrating that, and advocating continuously against systems that are still in place to harm us and that do not contribute to our healing.
What steps do you think are needed to move toward a more just system?
Whew. How long do we have? Yeah, I think a couple of things that are necessary. So many folks in our communities talk about abolition, about this idea that our healing and our well-being is not happening inside of institutions. It doesn't happen through punishment, through force, through coercion, really uplifting these massively important social, political, and economic barriers that exist for so many people who aren't getting their needs met. And I think especially in the moment we're in, I'll just say building relationships with each other that are not rooted in fear, that like, do we have the capacity to care about strangers as much as we care about our mothers, our children, the people in our lives? That's something that's really important. And then always important to name that mental illness is often so deeply associated with violence, which drives our decision making around treatment, around what to invest in. And it's very, very important to know that folks who are labeled with mental illness are much more likely to be on the receiving end of violence rather than engaging in violence directly themselves. So something for all of us to be on learning.
If there was something that you wish that mental health professionals and just people in the world knew, what would that be?
Ooh, I would say if somebody's actions or words or behavior is not making sense to you, you are missing a part of their context, a part of their experience. There have been many times in my life where what I was going through made no sense to people on the outside, made very, very deep sense to me. And we might not always get the whole picture. Something my partner talks about, who is a traditional healer, is that people who are navigating mental health crises or conditions, they might be on page 52 of a book that has 51 pages before it, but we don't have access to that. So trying to view these experiences more like a movie that we have to let play out rather than something that we can pause and cut and adjust, always be editing, that sometimes the answer is to just be present and watch and make space for folks and allow people to make space for their own understandings of how they're coming into crisis or into what we call mental illness.
Stefanie, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mary. It was great to speak with you.
And we thank Stefanie for sharing that really valuable perspective. Kurt White is rejoining the conversation and got the chance to listen along with us. And this is now our second episode, really talking about alternatives to the mental health system.
Yeah, I find it very inspiring to hear Stefanie's story about, first herself realizing that maybe the help that she and others around her needed wasn't available in ways that were actually helpful because of the way that systems were organized, but didn't stop there, really went on to sort of actually create the thing that was missing in their own life, and then took that even a step further to create something with those principles, with those ideas that could really be helpful to others who maybe were similarly being left behind by a system that wasn't connecting with them.
And do you think we can bring these principles into our current system? Can we adapt?
Well, I think so. And maybe it's as simple sometimes as sort of opening our eyes to our own creativity and resourcefulness and those of people around us. I think, sometimes if someone has an inpatient hospitalization, for example, and has a good experience of it, and you say to them later, what was really good about it? They might mention the doctors or the medicines or the treatment or the therapy groups. As a professional, I guess I'm always hoping they say those things. But very often, actually what they say is, I met a number of people there who really understood what I was going through, often referring to peers, actually, to other folks on the unit. And sometimes I think whether or not people stay in touch in a long-term way, this experience of not being alone in something, of being a sort of a fellow traveler working to find your own solutions to your own problems, and even seeing somebody else do that, even when they do it very differently than you might, I think has a very inspiring, life-affirming quality. And I wonder if sometimes as professionals, part of what we have to do is just set that up, of just sort of say, if we look and see what's going on around us, how are people finding clever solutions to complex, difficult problems in their own lives? And really try to promote the things that make that kind of creativity and problem solving more possible for people. Maybe that's sort of the best intention of a psychotherapist, really.
So it might not even be the treatment or the medication, but just the fact that someone is no longer isolated and feeling alone.
I think the thing that we all want more than anything else is a healing community and set of relationships in our own lives. And I think sometimes things get in the way of that. Sometimes internal circumstances, maybe we call them symptoms, sometimes external circumstances, obstacles. And I think, can we clear away some of those obstacles to get people the connection they need, to get their creativity back, to find the way to really live life one day after another that feels really positive and life-affirming?
And that is the work Project Let's continues to do, and they continue to grow, too, spreading out across campuses, like you mentioned, high schools and colleges. And they have a really great website if you'd like to visit. We have it listed in our show notes, a lot of great information and resources on there. And you can also find Stefanie. We have her personal website listed as well.
I really hope that others can check these things out and learn from them as I think I have learned from them.
Definitely.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Unravelling is brought to you by Brattleboro Retreat and is produced by Charts and Leisure.
Find us on social media by searching Brattleboro Retreat. Brattleboro Retreat is committed to exploring diverse perspectives on mental health. While we invite hosts and guests to share their insights, the views expressed are their own and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of the hospital or its staff.